Hello, everyone. I hope this is the full chapter six that we're going to cover today, but it might be just a piece of it. We'll see how far we get through. Um, Chapter six gets into the title of it is Strengthening a Company's Competitive Position, Strategic Moves, Timing, and Scope of Operation. Uh, that sounds all good and wonderful, but what you begin to realize is we've actually talked about some of this in our uh, master strategy tools document. We already kind of went through some of that. We talked about this in regards to the company trying to grow and how to go about doing that. Now, we add in a component and we're going to add in a bunch of vernacular, okay, verbiage that we kind of already understand, or you should by now already understand. But admittedly, in my opinion, it sounds like a bunch of buzzwords. So we'll see how we get there. All right. So some of our learning objectives, learning whether and when to pursue offensive or defensive strategic moves to improve a firm's market position, recognizing when being a first mover or fast follower or a late mover or a bad date, no, can lead to a competitive advantage, identifying strategic benefits and risks of expanding a company's horizontal scope through merger acquisition, explain the advantages and disadvantages of extending a firm's scope of operation via vertical integration, describe the conditions that favor farming out the certain value chain activities to outside parties. Explain how strategic alliance and collaborative partnership can bolster a firm's collection of resource capabilities. Holy buckets, we got a lot of verbiage there that, again, you probably already understand. I don't know, maybe not. Let's just go through it. We already talked about some of this in the mergers and acquisitions, and you started actually understanding this when you were talking about the Ansoff matrix and how do we grow, uh, kind of along those lines. So I've already put out a document. I need to update it on D2L, and let's make sure that you guys are seeing what I'm seeing. No, no, come on down. There we go. Okay. So I've spent quite a bit of time trying to find a resource for all of you that explains this idea of integration or business integration. And I don't know how many videos now I've watched. I've tried to read in multiple different textbooks. I've tried to find diagrams online. And as usual, I didn't find anything that tripped my trigger. So then I went and made my own by copying a free diagram that was online already. And I pulled some information from marymount.edu. I don't know if that's Mount Mary Mount. I don't know what it stands for. It's a university. They offer a DBA program if you're ever interested, which I wouldn't recommend unless you are trying to teach. Um, okay. So I really like their description and their examples of it, and that's why I'm putting it on D2L for you to read. In this class, when I say you need to read something, that means you need to read it. Okay, it's something you're going to be tested on in the future. And usually, if I'm having you stop and take the time to read something, that probably means I could not find an easier to understand resource out there. So, what we're getting into in this chapter is this idea of business integration, which is a fancy way of saying, well, okay, we know in the Ansoff matrix that we have a couple options to grow. One of them is we produce a new product um, and try to sell to existing customers, or we sell the same product to a new market or a new group of customers. So those are kind of our options, but there's a bunch of other options in there. One of them is, well, instead of trying to invent something new, what if we acquired the company that makes our raw materials or sends us, if we're Gillette, the company that actually makes the thin piece of wire razor. I don't know if that's Gillette that does it themselves, or maybe they sell the metal that is put into the stream of wire that makes the razor. So that idea is called integration when you're trying to acquire the firm. that makes that raw material, and it's called backward vertical integration. So the diagram on the screen tells you how this works. Now, in this scenario, we're going to be Ford Motor Company. I should have used Gillette though, because I like them. But we're going to be Ford Motor Company, and hopefully that'll make this a little easier to understand. Because again, when you hear the term integration, it is a buzzword. Um, it is something you're going to hear possibly in a boardroom by somebody that went to school for business and said, "Well, I think we should talk about some backward integration and what are our options there and what should we consider?" And it sounds all nice and neat, wonderful. But half the people in the room are sitting there saying, "What are you talking about integration?" Well, what they're talking about is in the supply chain, okay, in a vertical integration, you're buying either someone that is closer to the commodity or supplier. So you would be, if we're Ford Motor Company, some of our suppliers would be the 800 different companies that make all the parts that are put into a Ford F-150. Okay. There's different companies that make the seats, for example, or we're going to pretend they are. Or there's another company that makes the cup holders, the plastic cup holders. Okay. And then Ford Motor Company brings in all of these parts, and where they're specialized is actually putting it all together in their plant. Boeing does the same exact thing. I think it's an insane amount of suppliers in a Boeing airplane that you have all these folks, these companies from all over the world that manufacture parts to the airplane. They send them to Boeing in Seattle, and then from there, Boeing has the largest warehouse in the United States, or largest building, I should say, because they're manufacturing 747s. So in this building, they have a warehouse of all of these components. Some of them are used on more than one type of plane. Um, for example, first class seats could be used in the 787, could be used in the 747. So Boeing doesn't want to have to come out with a new type of first class seat. They're just going to pull it from maybe one of their other lines. So if Boeing were to decide that the producer, their supplier of these first class seats, was charging an arm and a leg when you looked at the raw materials. So Boeing wants to know what are the material costs. They're going to want to know every piece of information about that first class seat in the manufacture of it because they want to know would it be cheaper for us to maybe do this ourselves? Or, and I would also offer up a lot of times it's not cheaper, by the way, but sometimes it is cheaper. So Boeing wants to know that information because maybe they want to take over the manufacture of that first class seat. But right now, we'll say they have a supplier. Maybe a better idea instead of Boeing trying to purchase that first class seat, maybe instead they should, just buy the supplier of that and then cut out all the management people in there because they have their own management team they'll send in to take over the company. And then they'll take it over and run it and they'll own that business on top of owning the manufacture of this. So in our example here, we're going to be Ford Motor Company, very similar to like a Boeing. They put the whole thing together and then they send it out to a distribution. Here we have shipping. They don't have shipping, but they do have a distribution system of trucks or semis that move these here all over the United States. So in that supply chain, you have from the standpoint of Ford, you have upstream. Upstream are the people that manufacture the raw material, so the iron ore, the plastic, um, the aluminum, all of that. Those are the folks that make the commodities and the raw material. Then they send those raw materials usually to another uh, factory or production facility that then smelts the metal or siphons off the part of the petroleum that goes into making the plastic. And then from there, those companies will usually like make the plastic into little tiny balls of plastic that then they're going to send out to somebody else. Like in Brookings here, I don't know, I think we still have it as Falcon Plastics. So Falcon Plastics is a company that buys these raw material beads and then they manufacture them into different plastic components that are then sold to 1,000 different companies in the United States. Okay. So their Falcon Plastic specialty, if they are, I think they're still around, um, is to create the mold and pump that raw material or that plastic bead into the mold to then make a million little plastic pieces that then go get sent to Ford Motor Company, and Ford Motor Company screws that in somewhere in their the Ford F-150. So you have the commodity people, you have the suppliers. Then when we go forward, we're Ford Motor Company, you go all the way forward and you hit the customer in the supply chain. Okay. Now, right before that, you might have some form of a distributor. Um, so, for example, in Brookings, you have Einspar Auto Plaza. That would be the distributor. And in some cases, you might even look at them as the customer because maybe they buy the vehicle from Ford and then they go sell it themselves. But in certain cases, I think they lease them. There's a weird structure to automotive distribution we won't get into, but something like that. So if we're looking backward and we're forward, the commodities, the suppliers of the parts, those types of things. If Ford wanted to buy them, we call that backward integration, and it would be considered vertical integration. Okay. If we're Ford Motor Company and we're looking at the distribution and then the Einspar Auto Plaza, and we were to buy that part of the value chain or the supply chain, excuse me, we would look at that as forward integration. It's still vertical because we're going up and down, but it would be forward. Okay. Then you have what's called horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is really just acquiring a competitor. That's what it is. So we call it horizontal, obvious from left to right. So a lot of times when you hear this terminology, you need to have the picture of this diagram in your head. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense. Okay. So from today until the day you die, because you're getting a business degree, I want you to remember that the forward or downstream is a part of the vertical integration. Okay. If we're Ford Motor Company, Einspar Auto Plaza, if we wanted to purchase those, what do I want to call them? I can't think of the term. It's going to kill me. Uh, Dealership, there it is. Holy buckets. So if we're Ford and we want to buy back these dealerships, okay, that would be a part of vertical integration. And for us, it would be a forward integration. If you're Ford and we want to buy the suppliers, the commodity companies that make the metal and the aluminum and the steel, then that would be a backward integration. And then you have the forward, or excuse me, the horizontal integration, which would be Ford buying one of their competitors. Um, in that mode or idea. Okay. So when you try to understand integration, it's a fancy word, and especially if you get into like computer and technology, integration can, if you don't know what you're looking at, it's very hard to follow the conversation that's going on. But if you have this diagram in cemented in your mind from now until the day you die, I think you'll be able to understand the conversation that's being had when we talk about vertical integration, backward vertical integration, forward vertical integration, and then horizontal integration. Now, the document that I have included again on D2L, I'm going to go there now. Yep, I copied and pasted it directly from whatever this Mount Mary because it was out of the 10 different sources I read, that one explained it quicker than anything. So if you go into D2L into our section under Bruce's docs, you have the master strategy tools, and then you have the 5 types of business integration. This document then will go through and explain each types of these business integrations. Um, they talk about the benefits of it. Now, I think a lot of times one of the issues we have is we're trying to understand either why would you not always do a type of business integration, or why why not do it? It's if you imagine you're running a company and you're trying to take over the world because that's what you're supposed to be doing as a company, then wouldn't you want to buy up all of the suppliers? Wouldn't you want to buy up all of the forward vertical integration, all the people that are distributing it? Because if you own more of everything, you control it, you get out more middlemen and administration, and then you make more money, right? Well, that's not the way it works. Okay. And that goes back into our document. I'm going to go there now in our master strategy and tools. Again, we've covered this to some extent. Sadly, it's faster for me to just re-download this. You're good with it though. So at the very end of our master strategy and tools, we talk about mergers and acquisitions. Oh, I hate it when this happens. There we go. All right. When we scroll near to the end there, past all of the documentation, no, this can be painful. Let's get down to our M&A, merger and acquisition stuff. So after the mission, there we go. So then we get into the mergers and acquisitions. So integration and often merger and acquisition, those are substitutes. Those are like the same thing. So if you hear integration, I want you to let go of the term integration because integration can be used in so many capacities, especially in technology. It's, well, we need to integrate this new platform to blah, 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 blah. And in most people's heads, they're like, what? Can you just use normal words, maybe? So think of merger acquisition. Again, you have vertical and you have horizontal. So that then translates to are we the parent firm or are we being targeted, okay, for acquisition? And then we go through and all of the same examples of, well, when should you merge and when should you not merge? Or when should you acquire or when should you not acquire? And there's a timing aspect to that. So this, one of the reasons I don't like the term integration is because I've seen too many times people are learning one, but they don't understand that it's really two things. It's like we play a word trick on you to get you to make this more complex when it really isn't that complex. Okay, so here are some theoretical reasons a firm might be targeted for takeover. So another way to say that is if we were looking at, well, what are some benefits of integration or merging and acquiring? It's the same thing. Reduce competition. You expand your customer base. There's cost reduction. You get an increase in market share. There's revenue growth. There's improved efficiencies. There's greater product and service differentiation, not diversification. There's access to new markets. There's increased market power. And then they go through some of these. Same as a merger acquisition, you have a couple different types. You have horizontal merger acquisition, you have vertical merger acquisition. Same idea. The thing that we add to this is forward integration and backward integration is just another fancy way of saying in the supply chain, are we going backwards to try to acquire someone or are we going forward to try to acquire someone? So when we go back, yep, we're jumping between two documents. There's a time when you would want to acquire that firm, and there's a time when you wouldn't. Okay. There's good reasons to do this, and there's bad reasons. Some of the good reasons are listed here. Okay. So, is there a tax benefit to acquiring this company? Is Boeing being able to take over the seat manufacturer? Is there some managerial expertise or knowledge that we're not currently sharing that if the supplier of the first class seats, if they knew that, it would save millions of dollars, but Boeing just wants to protect that and they want to keep it proprietary. Is there some technological expertise that Boeing would bring to the table? Would it help expand? Because if Boeing maybe owned the seat manufacturer, well, guess what? Now that seat manufacturer may also sell seats to Airbus. So maybe Boeing then begins to have to supply Airbus because there's not a ton of different seat manufacturers for airlines. Maybe it's to utilize excess capital. Maybe we're sitting on so much money. And when we sit on that much money, you have to remember, you have to earn. This is one I don't know that we touched on as hard as we needed to. When you are sitting on excess capital and you're the CEO, you're the executives running the company, you're the agent hired to run the company, that money you have sitting around in reserve or retained earnings, that is not your money. Okay, so you have to do something with it. You can't just keep it in a savings account and say, "Oh, we're good." It's no, in the investors, they assign a cost of capital to that savings account. So in other words, if I'm a stockholder, I'm investing into Poet, and Poet, let's say, is worth $500 million. If Dan Loveland or Poet CFO is sitting on $150 million and the company's only worth 500 million, so that'd be a huge amount they would be sitting on. Dan Loveland has to assign a cost of capital to that. And what we mean by that is he has to have an earnings on that cash reserve. And if he can't earn that, he needs to plow it back into something that can earn that cost of capital. So if we go through the risk adjusted rate of return, let's say it's I don't know, let's say for a stockholder at Ford. You know what? I'm going to hit pause here and we're just going to go right into it. Why? Because that's how we roll. Okay. So we're going to go. If you're hearing some noise in the background, my daughter is, I don't know, she's making something. Um, we're going to imagine again, we're Ford Motor Company. So if we're Ford Motor Company, hopefully you guys can see this now. Oh, come on here. If you wonder why I use Zoom for this, it's because it's easier to run than other systems. Okay, so right now we're looking at Yahoo Finance. By the way, on June 17th, 2025, the markets are tumbling and falling. A lot of that has to do with Israel and the bombing of Iran, trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapons because that would be bad for everyone. So if we look at Ford Motor Company, okay, and that is not Ford Motor Company. So you know what? We're going to hit pause again. Sorry. I think we got it now. Okay, now we have Ford Motor Company. If you wanted to buy a share of Ford Motor Company stock right now, it costs $10.42. If you wanted to buy the whole company today, it would be $41.43 billion is what it would cost you. If Ford Motor Company is sitting on, let's say, $5 billion in cash in their cash reserve, their retained earnings, the money they just kind of have sitting around here. If they're on $5 billion, you'd think, well, that's a good thing. It kind of is, kind of isn't. Okay. If they were above a certain amount, the stockholders of Ford would want either Ford to pay back that money in the form of a dividend, or they would need Ford to start earning money off of that retained earnings. Okay. So, excuse me. If we were to try to figure out what that cost of capital is that the CFO would have to assign that, to figure it out, it's the weighted average cost of capital, but it's just the equity. So we're going to figure that out for ourselves. So how much money or how much of a rate of return do we need to assign that cash reserve for Ford Motor Company? We have to use the capital asset pricing model. And we talked about this before. So the average rate of return on a large cap company is about 10.4%. If we were to look at what a risk-free rate is right now, we're going to say it's about 4.3%. Then we need to figure out the level of risk that's assigned Ford Motor Company. So here we see a beta coefficient risk, which is the risk component to our calculation. It's 1.51. It's above one, so it's more risk than the market overall. Um, to understand that, I would say in most beta coefficients that I've seen, I don't think I've ever seen it higher than like three or four. Um, Less than one is less risk than the market. Exactly one is the same risk of the market. Above one is more risk than the market. I would say if you saw a beta coefficient of like three, holy buckets, we're talking high risk. When you see more, I would say on average, I see anywhere between 1.01 to 1.8, something like that. So Ford's Motor Company's beta coefficient is 1.51. So we go in here, we enter 1.51, we hit calculate, and we get a risk adjusted rate of return of 13.51%. So Ford Motor Company has to have a rate of return on that cash it's sitting on of it's usually slightly less than whatever this capital asset pricing model is. So it would be if it's at 13.51%, the retained earnings would have a cost of capital of probably like 13%. So if the CFO can't earn 13% on that money that's just sitting in a savings account, and the savings account might yield you what, like 2% right now or 3% or something like that. That's nowhere close to 13%. So the CFO wants to plow that money back into opportunities to grow Ford Motor Company. That's the point. That's the intent. The thing that we run into is, well, what do you do with that in order to do it? Okay, so let's go back to our document here. And the answer is, well, you have to grow. You have to do something with that. So, what knowledge do you possess? You have two fundamental pieces of knowledge. You have a knowledge of manufacturing or producing either a product or a service. So, if you're Ford Motor Company, you know a thing or two about the vehicle manufacturing process. Okay. What you don't know about is manufacturing a razor to sell to veterinarians. You know nothing about that. So when the CFO is looking to expand, they want to stay away from stuff they know nothing about. They want to revolve around the things that they're very knowledgeable in. Okay. So that gets into this idea of integration. Okay, is we know a thing or two going in this direction. We know a thing or two about going in the horizontal direction because we're competing directly. We stay away from that which we don't know. All right. So when we're talking about business integration, there's reasons you do it, there's reasons you don't do it. Some of the benefits of integrating vertically, especially, is all of these. Those are reasons you would want to do it. Okay. And there's five types. There's horizontal, up and down, and or vertical, up and down, horizontal from left to right. Then you have forward, okay, which is forward here, or you have backward, which is back here. Okay, that's four. Then you have a fifth one, which is called a conglomerate merger or a conglomerate integration. A conglomerate integration, try to go to it here, is usually when a company owns a bunch of different companies. Some are very related to what they're doing. Some of them may not look very related. Okay. When the company is a conglomerate, let's say like 3M, I probably complained about this before, I'll complain about it again. My wife worked at 3M, has worked at 3M since 2005. I served in the United States Marine Corps and I served from 99 to 2003. While I was in, one of the biggest problems we had, I was in a combat unit in the invasion of Iraq. And one of the biggest problems we had is when you're shooting weapons, bombs are going off or mortars are going off, and all this is happening, and you're trying to attack, you can't hear anything. You're hearing like all you have is ringing ears, but you can't put in earplugs to block all of the sound because if you block all the sound, you can't hear commands, you can't hear what's going on. So, knowing this problem, a company came out and they made this little earplug thing, and it had two sides to it. Let's just go there if we haven't already gone there. No, let's go to image. Okay, here it is. So this is what the earplug looked like that this company manufactured. So you pull it out and you turn it around. If you needed it to complete the sound to be completely blocked, you would put I think it was the green side in. Well, actually, that right there tells you. Um, so the green end would mean there's no sound getting in. If you put the yellow side in, it means it was getting filtered. So the idea was it would bring down the overall noise level to like 75%. So you could still hear people yelling, but you weren't having your ears blown off when, you have guns going off and everything around you. So 3M heard about this company that manufactured these three earplugs and they thought, nice, that's like nobody else figured out how to do this. So they ended up buying this company. Well, to find out later that when 3M bought this company, the company had dry labbed their results. And what that means is when they were doing their research, they were lying about the data collection and like, well, what was really happening. And they weren't sharing that when the earplug was not totally protected in the if when it was in the yellow inside, so it was filtering it, it really wasn't filtering very much. It was much less than what they said. So you had all of these folks in the military that were using this earplug and thinking that it's filtering and blocking sound, and it wasn't doing what it said it was supposed to do, and people were getting hearing damage because of this. Now, the reason I get angry about this is prior to this company coming out and doing this, when I was in, the earplugs that we used were cigarette butts, and we would only ever have it in one ear. I would usually, I think I would have a cigarette butt in my right ear if I had anything at all, and then I would have to leave the left one out because when I had the rifle, yeah, that would make sense. So here, I still have hearing damage in my left ear. And the reason I'm frustrated about this is because there was a $6 billion settlement, which totally caused 3M to have to divest and restructure its entire corporate conglomerate because of this stupid lawsuit. They were trying to protect their assets. Um, the reason I get frustrated is nobody stopped and said, well, what did the veterans get that didn't have any of these earplugs and didn't get to use any earplugs because they had to hear? And the answer is I don't get anything. I have hearing damage and I'm not going to get a dime. I didn't even have something that filtered at 5%. My left ear is totally damaged. Why are we talking about this? Because the question would be, why would 3M buy a company that, what do they know about earplugs? And the answer is they actually know quite a bit because they manufactured earplugs previously. So this just got added in as a good portfolio. Now it's conglomerate because 3M doesn't just do earplugs. They do more products than I can even get close to naming. Everything from tape to like medical tape to duct tape to, well, technically, I don't think they call it duct tape. Um, that's its own brand. They own all of these businesses that if you looked at each business unit, you'd think these can't possibly be related. But if you know what you're looking at and you're understanding like manufacturing, you will start seeing that there are core competencies that are either shared or they go hand in hand together. Okay. So it might be that 3M was wanting to get the technological expertise at how to make this earplug. Now, that didn't pan out real well, but whatever. So that's a conglomerate merger is you don't think it looks related, but maybe there is a relation in there somewhere. Now, the reason if you're running the company that's important is because if you cannot give a logical rationale based on what we're talking about here, good reasons to merge. So if 3M's buying this, the investor class wants to know that the agent isn't doing it to build an empire. But one might say, well, isn't that what you want to do is build an empire? Yes, if there's logic and rationalization in doing so. If there's matching core competencies or there's a synergistic benefit to those core competencies. Okay. The other reason conglomerates are often done or mergers or integrations is because management might think like we're awesome at managing things. It's just let's buy it, we'll send in our people, we'll run it, and it'll be great. Now, let's get back to the problem with that. 50 to 80% of the time, mergers and acquisitions fail to create value. That means even though that's your intent, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to materialize. In fact, a lot of the times it doesn't. Now, that 50 to 80% is argued, by the way, in the world of finance. They argue it all the time. Your textbook talks about mergers and acquisitions can be very, or excuse me, integration, vertical integration, horizontal integration, or excuse me, vertical integration in the supply chain can very often attribute value. In other words, a synergistic benefit can be produced because it's in that one product line or that product arena, for lack of a better words. Okay, so those are the ways we integrate. So then let's get into chapter 6. You're like, didn't we already do that, Bruce? So now we're trying to get into what are the strategies and things we want to be aware of before we do these mergers and acquisitions and these integrations. And the answer is, well, there's a strategic way to do this, there's a timing component, and there's a scope of operations, which is kind of like, what do you know how to do? All right. So hopefully that will help us a little bit as we go through this. So when we talk about the timing of the strategic move, and I would love to say I understand what your textbook's trying to talk about here, but in part I don't. They go through and say, well, what are you trying to do, offense or defense? Okay. Um, an offensive strategy would be like an integration. It's let's go buy somebody in the supply chain. Okay. A defensive strategy also could be doing the same thing. It's just we're not trying to make money. We're just trying to prevent our competitor from making money. Okay. So that's kind of the difference between the offense and the defense. So that gets into, well, what's the scope of what are we trying to accomplish? So a vertical integration tries to broaden resources and capabilities in order to achieve cost efficiencies. Outsourcing, now that's where we get back into the integration. Here's what we've realized because mergers and acquisitions very often don't create value. Integration, vertical integration can create value. Horizontal, that less so. Okay, because there's a knowledge set there that each party has learned in the vertical integration. My daughter also told me I use my hands a lot in the videos, and all the thumbnails are always me like going like this. So I'm gonna try to get a good thumbnail picture for this on YouTube. Okay, sorry. Um, one of the issues is outsourcing. Okay. What we know very honestly is with outsourcing, a lot of times that works better than trying to do an integration. Why? Because if you think about a company, so let's use Falcon Plastics, for example. So Falcon Plastics manufactures these little plastic parts that get put into all sorts of things, everything from airplanes to, you know, microphones. Those they know how to make these molds and how to inject the 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 petroleum, the plastic in there in a way that it takes a long time to figure out how to do that. When they've figured out how to do that, well, now they have a piece of knowledge that maybe other people that do something similar, they don't know how to do it. Maybe they know how to do something that none of the other plastic manufacturing companies know how to do. Okay. So the question is, would Boeing want to buy Falcon Plastics and or would it be better to actually divest and just have Falcon Plastics or all these other companies make these components on their own? And the answer is usually it's often better to just let them do it on their own because they do what they do best. When you have a General Electric, when you have a conglomerate that comes in and takes over a company, oftentimes you lose the incentive that the previous owner, especially like the founder of a company, has a huge incentive to be effective and efficient. And when you pull that person out and now you put the person that owns this at a hedge fund in New York, that's overseeing 75 different companies, they may not be very much paying attention to Falcon Plastics or even care how it's managed or what it does. It's you have the principal and the agent so far removed from each other that there isn't that incentive to manage the company better and better and more efficiently and more efficiently. So when that's why we say a lot of times outsourcing is a better option because then you have that principle. When you can take the principal and the agent and make it the same, then you have pretty strong alignment between um, the incentives for the effectiveness and the efficiency there. The farther the principal and the agent, so the principal is the investor, the owner, the agent is the manager, the hired gun to come in and run the company. When those are separated, and the farther you could think of that metaphorically or literally, the farther they are, the less of an incentive to be more effective and efficient, typically. So outsourcing is a way to kind of get the best of both worlds. Then there's an incentive because the founder, the owner of the company that's creating this has an aligned incentive that's appropriate to make the most efficient, most effective product or service. Okay, we're going to move on. Your book tries to get into that, and it doesn't make any sense to me. So there we go. Um, I think one of the problems that I have, you'll notice in this last chapter and current chapter, I'm talking about, well, the problems I have with the way they explain this is they're trying to extract a theory and a formula and do so descriptively in order to then make a predictive model based on whatever we're talking about. The problem in business is the way you run a manufacturing facility and the way you run a cleaning business on the East Coast are not the same thing. So to try to put an overlay on either one of those, talking about strategy, it becomes a bit of a challenge, and it takes a person to dive very deep in either one of those to understand the overall strategy. So otherwise, what this turns into in part is kind of gook of, well, wait, what are we supposed to be doing here? Um, there is a competitive nature to this, but the competitive nature of this would be the same as if you were in combat, as if you were in business. Very similar idea. You're trying not to die, and then after you don't die, then you're trying to win because if you don't win, you're going to die. Okay, that type of thing. Um, yeah, I would take a picture of this one. So these are options for an offensive strategy. So one option might be trying to offer an equally good or better product at a lower price. So you're trying to undercut the competition. So let's go back to our integrative strategy. Okay. When you're doing that, you're talking about the horizontal model. So when Ford tries, if they want to be offensive, let's say they go head to head with GM. I think GM makes Chevy. If they don't, sorry, I'm not a car guy, but we're going to pretend that they do. So if Ford's F-150 goes head to head with Chevy's, I think it was Silverado the last I knew. If they're going head to head in a certain product class, one of the ways that they can kind of undercut GM or Chevy would be to sell a similar product, but do it for like 10% less. Okay, so that would be considered an offensive strategy. Another option would be leapfrogging competitors by being the first to market with next generation technology or products. So if Ford again wants to beat its horizontal competitor here, they might try to invent the next latest and greatest. So in 2025, the automotive companies are trying to figure out how do we produce self-driving cars, which I can't believe I'm actually saying that. 10 years from now, if you're watching the same video, you're probably all laughing like, Bruce, all of us drive or have self-driving cars today. Well, today we don't. So maybe Ford could come in and find a way to create a self-driving car, but they sell it for the same or just slightly more than what their current F-150 is going for. And especially if none of the other competitors can figure out how to do it, well, there you go. That's an offensive strategy. One other thing to note about that is one of the big reasons they don't have more of those self-driving vehicles, I've heard, I don't know, is that you need 5G. Um, I don't even know what 5G is, but as opposed to 4G is the speed at which the technology can process, or our network, the speed at which it can do that. If it doesn't have 5G, apparently it doesn't work real well. So you're going to see self-driving cars more likely in places, urban settings, much more than you would be, say, in Volga, South Dakota. Um, Another offensive strategy would be to constantly create new innovations and trying to kind of go toe to toe with the rivals that don't usually come out with the new latest and greatest products, and again, maybe sell it for a same or similar price. Pursue disruptive product innovations, try to create new markets. I don't want to get into that because that could just take us down a huge rabbit hole, but it's one of our offensive strategic options. Adopting or approving on a good idea from other firms or rivals. So Ford Motor Company, let's say, it doesn't have a self-driving car strategy. One of the things they might do is look at Toyota, who does have a good self-driving car strategy, and maybe they, go out and buy one of these vehicles and then they bring it back into their shop and they strip apart and they have their electricians and their computer scientists look at what's this company using to do this. And then once they figure that out, then maybe they try to make an even better motherboard or computer system that can run this that's faster and better. Um, there's also the use of guerrilla tactics in business, and these are tactics that usually very quickly will grab sales from the competition, especially those that aren't paying attention. I'm not going to get into these. Take a marketing class. You'll learn more about guerrilla warfare tactics. Um, Launching a preemptive strike to capture a rare opportunity or secure an industry limited resource. So again, these are all offensive strategies. Um, Now let's just keep going. Another question, if you're trying to use an offensive strategy, is what rivals do you want to go after? And this would be another good test question. Who would you want to attack on the offensive? Market leaders that have some vulnerability would be a good one, or a runner-up firm that has a weakness in areas where you're strong. Struggling businesses in the industry that are on the verge of going under. To me, you're talking about an offensive strategy, but at that point, usually you're getting into integration or merger and acquisition. Is then you want to look at, well, do they possess any knowledge or niche that you can take over and buy that would add to your competitive parity that you don't currently have? Or small local and regional firms with limited capabilities. Those are all companies that might be good to go after. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, but Bruce, I'm not aggressive like that. I don't want to attack anybody. I just want to make a product or service. There are some environments you can do that. There's also some environments where it is highly competitive. And if you don't do these types of strategies, you either choose to not compete, in which case you better have a heck of a sustainable competitive advantage and you better guard that with your life, or you're not in an environment where profit margins are very high and there's just not a lot of competition. You either will have to defend, it's kind of like an either or. You're either going to have to defend, and defense might be offense, or you're in a competitive landscape, or you're not. Um, I don't know where I was going with that, but there it is. Another piece of vernacular or verbiage I want you to know is called the blue ocean strategy. Um, One option a company can do is to try to find a sustainable competitive advantage by choosing to basically not compete with the other industry and just go all in on a completely, totally new form of however this is being accomplished. So, a good way to look at a market I've been told, this is an old business school story, is to look at the world not in terms of what it is you're building or creating, but look at the world in terms of what purpose do you serve? Okay. The old adage is the owner of the trolley cars in San Francisco, all of the guys' advisors told him you need to start diversifying. Um, and instead of looking at the world in terms of we make trolley cars, instead look at the world in terms of how do we get people from point A to point B, especially when there's incline. And then think about the 100 different ways that that's done. So maybe instead of doing trolley cars, maybe you need to think of yourself as in the transportation business. And if you're in the transportation business, what is transportation going to be 20 years from now? And maybe you need to let go of that old business and start going into the new business. Now, again, there is a knowledge relationship of knowledge issue at stake. What do you know how to do? Okay. Um, so that's often called a blue ocean strategy, is you're just totally going off into a different world, but you think it's going to be so lucrative it wouldn't matter. You can imagine if you're Ford Motor Company, your investors aren't going to accept that. Your management is not going to accept that, especially if you're working with things like labor unions. You can't just drop everything you're currently doing and just go all in one direction. Usually, privately held firms can do that far easier than, and especially if you have one sole owner of a company, that's a lot easier to do than if you're talking about, 14 different mutual funds own you, and now you're controlled. Um, One example is Circa D, I don't, Dale Lay or whatever, um, reinvented the circus and has attracted millions of people that normally would never attend circus events by putting it in um, different theaters and places like in Las Vegas. Oh, and we say this over and this type of a strategy over and over and over, especially in the technological world that we operate in. Things change so quick and so fast. You're, this is kind of why you have to be on your toes, is because what you're doing today may not be what you're doing tomorrow. How you do it matters, though. Um, Oftentimes, the blue ocean strategy can offer growth in revenues and profits by discovering new and inventing new industries and segments that otherwise weren't in existence before. Then we get into defensive strategies, protect a company's market position, and increase the competitive advantage. So, when a company engages in defensive strategies, they lower the risk of being attacked. If they are attacked, they weaken the attack because they're on the defense. They're prepped for it. Um, they can influence those going after them to go after your competitor instead of you because you were prepared for it. And then the old adage, a good defensive strategy helps protect competitive advantage, but is never the basis or should never be the basis for a strategy. In other words, you want to know this is what you're doing, but if you're playing a game of just being all on the defense and you're not strategizing to go somewhere and you're not making forward movement, that's not a good reason to do that's not a good reason for whatever strategy. Offense, winning, success, those are reasons why, or that's what you create a strategy based on, trying to win the game, not just trying to protect what you currently have. Um, I- am I'm just gonna scroll through this. So ways to block, excuse me, avenues open to challengers, offer new features, adding new models. I'll let you read the rest of that. Um, there, business is kind of weird because one of the things that we can do, you can't collude with another company. That's illegal. So, especially anything with like price, you would never want to contact your competitor and say, huh, yeah, we were thinking about having a sale next week and we're going to lower our prices to, I don't know, $10 per unit, you wouldn't ever share that with a competitor because then the competitor would be like, oh, okay, but you're not going to go under $10? Okay, well, we'll do the same thing. And that way, if neither one of you is going to decrease under $10, you've just colluded to set the price, which is illegal. Now, that being said, there are ways to signal competition and signal that you are willing to do an offense or a defense, or excuse me, a defensive strategy if they try to come after you. Okay. Um, Examples of that are publicly announcing management's strong commitment to maintain the current market share, committing publicly to a policy of matching a competitor's terms of price, having a war chest or cash reserves available, and or what's called treasury stock. So treasury stock is stock of the for a publicly traded company. The company itself, General Electric, holds treasury stock. So it has, let's say, 10 million shares of its own stock that it owns internally on the books. So one of the options is it can go sell those shares to gain cash quickly, and then it automatically receives a rate of return that is the same of the company, like we talked about before, with retained earnings and that cash reserve. By having that in treasury stock, by the very nature of it, you're earning the same. So that's one option as opposed to having a war chest of cash. The problem is when the company goes to sell that treasury stock, they rarely can get the amount that it's currently being offered at because they're if they go to sell that stock, they don't usually do it directly. They go through a brokerage firm because they're trying to hide who's actually selling this. But it can't be hidden for long. So if let's say GE contacts Goldman Sachs, who's their broker, and says, "Hey, we got like 10 million shares of stock here. We want to go ahead and sell because we want to raise cash." Goldman Sachs puts in an order, and at some point, General Electric has to announce that they are selling those shares of stock. That can either be a warning sign or an indication that they're getting ready to do something. But it also can be a warning sign that the company is needing cash, maybe because it can't make payroll. So it causes the stock price to go down, which is not what you're supposed to do if you're running a company. Um, yeah, make occasionally strong counter responses to moves of weaker competitors to, I don't, yeah, whatever that means. Okay. Yeah, you can read that. They're talking about the timing and kind of the when. One thing I do want to note is this idea of what's called a first mover strategy. Um, so you have a leader follower dynamic that can happen. Um, when you do that, there's an advantage, but there's also disadvantages. Okay. So maybe you want to be the first company that gets into self-driving cars. There's an advantage to that where you'll learn how to do it a lot faster than others. The problem is you're going to spend a boatload of money and you're probably going to get sued a number of times because people are probably going to die when you have a self-driving car at some point. That being said, if you invented self-driving cars basically, or look like you invented it, that's going to be an advantage in the long run versus the company that said, yeah, we started doing it after them. We copied what they were doing. Um, you get the idea of the strategic importance of that. And then you have late mover or second or third or fourth or fifth mover advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, I'll let you try to answer that one. Is the race to market leadership a marathon or a sprint? I've never seen anybody say it's anything other than both. Depends on the day. Some days you sprint, other days it's a marathon. Ultimately, though, business is almost always conducted in the long term, not the short term. It, but if you're a publicly traded firm, it's going to feel like it's just a ton of different sprints because every day you have pressure on you. Um, yeah, I don't want to. Well, let's just define this. The scope of the firm refers to the range of activities the firm performs internally. Okay. The breadth of its product and service offerings. When we talk about breadth, there's breadth and depth. Breadth, you know what? I'm gonna hit pause on that one because I always get this one screwed up and I don't want to screw you up. And we're back. Okay, when we talk about the scope and you're talking about these ideas of like breadth and depth, breadth and depth. Okay, when we talk about scope of breadth and depth, depth is like if you imagine this as Wilson, the sport manufacturing company. Product depth is like of all the Wilson tennis rackets, the depth is how many various types of those do they have? Breadth is different product lines. So when you hear the term in marketing and in business, depth and breadth, it's usually talking about this. Um, so let's redefine that. So the scope of the firm refers to the range of activities the firm performs internally, the breadth of its product or service offerings. What's breadth? Okay. Breadth is all of these different product lines. Okay. The extent to its geographic market presence, and its mix of business or business units. So when we say scope, that's what we're talking about. Is it narrow in scope or is it broad in scope? Then you have horizontal scope and vertical scope. Horizontal scope is the range of product and service segments that a firm serves within its focal market. A vertical scope is the extent to which the firm's internal activities encompass one, some, many, or all of the activities that make up an industry's entire value chain system. Okay. So let's go back to our Word document. I hope. There we go. Okay. When we talk about the scope, sorry, we're going to jump. The vertical scope is the supply chain. The horizontal is this. So if we look at Ford and Chrysler, how many different product lines and what is Ford's scope of operating relative to its competition? So for example, 100 years, no, not 100 years ago, many years ago, there was a company called Humvee that made these huge utility vehicles. They had produced them for the military. Um, Jeep used to be the main vehicle, but Humvee made the Humvee. I'm not going to use the other term because kids laugh at me when I say that. Um, but they had the H1, H2, and H3. Okay. That's all they sold. So their scope, their horizontal scope is very narrow. Okay. They don't have a lot of different vehicles. They have a very small amount, therefore they can get really good at it. All right. And we've already talked about mergers and acquisitions. So in integration, we're kind of putting this all together. Okay. Um, again, we've talked about merger and acquisition. Yep, and we've already talked about that. So we should be good there. Oh, lovely. Yep, yep. And we talked about that at the beginning. Let's touch on outsourcing. We kind of already did already, but we want to make sure we understand it. So outsourcing involves contracting certain pieces or components in the value chain to outside specialists or folks that know how to do this, and they're better at doing it. Okay. Um, there's a when should you do it and when should you not do it? And the book would argue a firm should guard against outsourcing activities that hollow out the resources and capabilities that it needs to be the master of its own destiny. I know that sounds like Dungeons and Dragons, but that's what you're thinking about when you're like, should we really be doing this or should this be done by somebody else? Well, it's relative to if you do outsource it to somebody else, are you now going to be at the behest of this company? So if they get you those seats, your Boeing and first class seats, and they're late every time they do it. Therefore, you can't get out your end product at a certain date, and there's only one supplier of airline seats. Okay. Well, at that point, Boeing might want to bring that in-house and try to do it internally. Okay. Because it needs to be the master of its own de destiny when it's selling $100 million products. Um, Times when you should consider outsourcing, when it can be performed better or more cheaply by outside specialists, which is more, I would argue it's more often than not. Okay. When it's not crucial to achieve a sustainable competitive advantage and won't hollow out the capabilities or core competencies or technical know-how of the firm. What does that mean? It means it's not associated with your core competency and your sustainable competitive advantage. And that's the whole goal of the deal. So if you're Boeing, what would Boeing's sustainable competitive advantage be? Now, there's only two large airplane manufacturers. There's Airbus and there's Boeing. Well, why do airlines go with one versus the other? And when you answer that, that tells you, that kind of gives you their sustainable competitive advantage. One of them is Boeing airplanes are often more tightly controlled by the pilot. Airbus planes are more tightly controlled by a computer system that runs everything, which is a fair argument because when they reviewed and looked at most airline crashes, the number of times it was pilot mistake, it was too much. So they said, we're going to take that out of the pilot's hands and we're going to have a computer do it so something doesn't get screwed up. The downside to that, by the way, is when I think it was 2009, there was Air France, there was a crash in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And what had happened was you have a computer running most of this plane. They actually, in modern Airbuses, they just have a tiny little joystick that flies this huge behemoth, you know, thing. Well, if you go into a Boeing airplane, it has a whole control stick turn, you know, a bunch of different movements and two rudder pedals and all of this. So the pilot has way more control. And most of the time you have pilots kind of like to stick with either Boeing or Airbus airplanes. So then what's the sustainable competitive advantage? And they kind of have, they're both niche. It's, well, if you want the plane to run itself largely because pilots make mistakes, well, then you probably want to go with Airbus. If you want the pilot to be the ultimate commander of this, then maybe you should go with Boeing. So in order to manufacture each one of those takes a knowledge set and a core competency of the build of said plane. Okay. So that's usually there. If you're outsourcing something that is a part of each of the sustainable competitive advantages of each of these competitors, Airbus or Boeing's going to want to stop and say, "Oh, should we be outsourcing this, or is there a danger in having a third party make the computer that runs the plane?" Um, that kind of gives you the idea. When should it outsource? When should it not? Maybe if you're Airbus, you're like, yeah, we don't know anything about how to make computers. And in fact, I believe this is the case. They basically just have two or three or four redundant, uh, like I think it's like almost like a laptop computer system that runs it. Of course, it's air gapped where it's not on a network or anything, so it doesn't have all. You don't care. Sorry. Um, when should you not outsource? It improves organizational flexibility and speeds time to market. Okay. So if there's a time component, if you have someone external doing it because they're better at doing it and they're faster at doing it, then your time span might be shorter. Well, then outsourcing it would be good. If you have a supplier that is not doing that, well, then maybe you need to do it internally. Uh, Reduces the firm's risk of exposure to changing technology or buyer preference. So if that's a piece of it, well, what again makes more sense? External or do it internally. And lastly, it allows a firm to concentrate on its core business, leverage its key resources and core competencies, and do even better with what already they do best. So again, Boeing has most of the manufacturing of everything on the plane is done externally. What they're good at is putting it together and then making sure it flies and then a quality control. And I know everybody kind of laughs, especially in 2025, at Boeing's quality control because it seems to have slipped here late. Um, but when you look at their quality control to say, oh, I don't know, almost every other industry, their quality control is pretty tight. So is the outsourcing going to impact what it is they do best, or is there a threat behind that? Big risk of outsourcing strategy, farming out the wrong types of activities, and thereby hollowing out strategically important capabilities that ultimately leads to a reduction in the firm's strategic competitiveness and long run success in the marketplace is a big risk, and the firm no longer is a master of its own destiny. I think that's funny because if you just take that out, is outsourcing going to prevent the company to no longer be the master of its own destiny? Then don't outsource. I'm going to hit Control Z so I get that all back. Um, One of the discussions is about strategic alliances. I'm not going to talk about corporate structuring here, um, but there are times when companies carefully, usually you have to have attorneys involved in this, can work together to standardize something in the industry or work together to solve a problem that normally they couldn't. When that happens, I've never heard or seen that happen without attorneys involved in doing it because you have to be very careful you're not colluding or price fixing. That's a big no-no. But there are times when, especially FTC, will allow a collaboration to happen again to solve a big problem in the industry that can't probably otherwise be solved. You see a lot of standardization happen in various places. In manufacturing, you have, I think it's ISO 9000, which is a standardization thing. And that's a bunch of manufacturing firms getting together saying, hey, we're going to create this standardization process. So we're all using the metric system and we're not using the English UK system or inches and stuff like that. Um, there's a whole host of different things you have to worry about if you do that. I do want you to be aware of what's called a strategic alliance, which is a formal agreement between two or more companies to work collaboratively towards some common objective. Again, you need to have attorneys when you're doing that because you got to spell that out because boy, you don't want to get sued for price fixing. Then you have a joint venture, which is a type of strategic alliance that involves the establishment of an independent corporate entity that is jointly owned and controlled by the two partners. We see this in the music industry, as you guys can see, I have guitars and music equipment in here. It's very common for like two guitar manufacturing companies to come together and they're going to pump money into creating a new type of pickup system for an electric guitar. They don't want because it's not in their interest to manufacture the pickups. Their job is to manufacture the whole guitar. So maybe they'll join together with two or three other guitar companies and say, hey, we're going to start our own joint venture and we're going to call it Johnny's Pickup Systems. So they'll invest to try to find the best way to do that. And then that'll be owned in part by each one of the companies, but it kind of will operate as its own company. Oh, uh, yeah, I just want you to read through this one. I'm not going to read it out loud. Reasons for companies to enter into a strategic alliance and some of the benefits, some of the things you want to watch out for, or problems that can happen. Uh, Let me leave that there again on the previous screen because you're going to see this as a test question. Might want to copy and paste that into a document so you have it accessible and the benefits. Pick up good partner. Be aware of the cultural differences, especially if you're either operating overseas with partners or even in the United States. My wife working with a company on the East Coast versus the Midwest there's a huge cultural challenge there when they do that. All right. Um, there, we're done. So apologies if that is too painful. Well, doesn't matter now because it's all over anyway. So there's chapter 6 for you. We will see you on the next go around. Peace out, sauerkraut.